So,
This is why also, and this is also another sense in which, for me, my being a Muslim is an indispensable part of being a Marxist-Leninist. Without Islam, my Marxism-Leninism has no object, right?
mhm.
It's because to me, it's very clear to me that when I, through the past few years, have made these connections and discovered these things, it became clear that we live in a pre-Muslim world, in a sense. Like, our world has not yet drawn out the consequences Islam has for humanity, for modern, for I should say, for modernity, I should say. And it has changed my perspective on modernity as a whole and Islam's place within it. To me, it's a matter of a kind of lost modernity and a lost enlightenment, which again began with my investigation of Marx's Jewish question, his work, The Jewish Question. As I was looking for answers to understand Islam from a Marxist perspective. And to me, both the West as well as the Muslim world at large have not awakened to this kind of new religious era of Islam. I think
That's a
it's
very
one of the only religions on earth. Like, for example, it's very clear the consequences of Christianity for the world in the form of
yeah.
modernity, in the form of, well, yeah, modernity itself, right? And the modern
Yeah.
era as such, as well as Judaism. But to me, what about Hinduism, Buddhism? Well, the issue with Hinduism and Buddhism is that they're not messianic religions. So those are more religions that deal with a kind of cyclical view of time, and as such, can be constantly reinvented across different epochs and different eras, including a new kind of, so to speak, Muslim era. Right? When I remember, I do come from this kind of perspective. When I say it's a Muslim era, I'm not saying exclusively Muslim, but you can look at it from that perspective. To me, Islam's consequences for modernity. Like, there's something very strange that happened in the Muslim world's encounter with modernity, which is, for the rest of the world, it was an apocalypse, the modern age. But for the Muslim world, it was seen as a kind of like almost competition, right? It never was able to fully conquer the Muslim world because it wasn't really seen as like a challenger. Like, through the French Revolution and all these changes in Europe, the Muslim world yawned. Like, the Muslim response, I don't know if you know this, to the French Revolution, for example, was, oh, they're overthrowing the king because they want to be equal and they all want to be treated like equal men. Yeah, it sounds like a Tuesday. You know what I mean? Like, that's this
Yeah.
kind of revolution. I mean, this was not seen as like a world-shaking thing in the Muslim world, whereas it upset everything in Europe. So to me, it's like, I don't know. It's also something I kind of prefer to usually keep private because it's almost like you lose touch with what really makes it unique if you're always talking about it. If that makes sense.
I think, by the way, that when we interpret the system of identity in the West and in Islam and the Islamic world, it's very, very, very distinct, right? It is very different, right? And so when the Muslims responded to the French Revolution in the West, what I think the primary issue that they saw was that in the West there are these set systems, these axiomatic systems
Yes,
of there are these axiomatic systems of form and how it must.
there's a neuroticism, a fundamental neuroticism of just this paranoia of a fortress, just safeguarding itself against the metaphysical outside, constantly dividing itself into hierarchies and absolute points of division, things that just seemed like a cope from like an Eastern or Muslim perspective, right? Yeah, which is more focused on this kind of reverence of real kind of. I mean, the reason why there's a fatalism associated with the Muslim world from the Western mind, from the Western gaze, is because the Muslim world, the object of Islam, divinity in Islam, and so on, is really associated with metaphysical being, just being, like what is real, what is almost in a kind of Nietzschean, although I'm not a fan of Nietzsche, I think he's a bad guy, but this is what conjures to mind in the Western mind. Whereas in the West, it seems like there is this eternal war between spirit and matter that has already been sublated in Islam.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, if you look at the systems of motion in the West and the East, what you will notice is the Western mind creates this most ideal form, and then everything rationally must conform to it, and
Precisely, precisely, yes.
they
and
force
and and
basically
here's and not only is it an ideal form that must be imposed upon the world, but every semblance of contradiction coming from the outside is conceived as the intentionality of a hostile and malign agent.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so there's this loss of organic development in Western thought, and so that's why a revolution is so in the West. Revolutions are these incredibly impactful events, which to this day, everybody talks about the French Revolution, how it changed history,
Yeah,
because in that moment, that most ideal, changeless, timeless object which everybody or form that everybody conforms to, at that moment received a strike against it, and then everybody goes crazy because they're like, well, wait a second, this is supposed to be the most ideal, timeless form, and the fact that something is breaking away from it or something is struggling against it, that is like are the object of the enemy. It's if that makes any sense.
yeah, no, I completely get it. But one of the things that troubles me, right, and this is why I have such a non-dogmatic view, and this is really what troubles me.
Yeah.
What happened to the Muslim world in this decisive period of early modernity, such that this folly, this Western folly, so to speak, that culminates in modernity, which is, modernity is this elevation of negation, right, and
Yeah.
abstraction and so on, spirit, basically, more or less, over and against all indeterminate and real things. But what
Yeah.
had happened in the history of Islam such that it had to be awakened to the shock of modern industry and modern cultural realities and so on and so on? I guess what I mean to say is, I personally don't know this. Would the Muslim world have organically developed what we call modern industry and modern society? Or was there something decisive about what happened in Europe that plays a decisive part in the history of Islam?
Yeah.
And to
Uh,
me, the question is like, why is it that this testing of realizing the absolute threshold between spirit and matter, form and content, head and body, had to really be just like, why did it have to be that? Why couldn't the Muslim world itself muster the power within itself or the potentiality within itself to really probe the threshold between, for example, mankind's relationship to nature? And maybe there, it's an open question here, is there are traditionalist perspectives that will say we could have, but we knew it was basically bad to. Like, for example, modern industry and electricity and so on, these is like a opening to demons, and even though you will live better, like, you know what I mean? Like, it reminds me of how, for example, Chinese military, the development of the Chinese military was by no means tied to their technological capabilities. They were able to develop weapons and technologies that they intentionally did not because of tradition and morality and things like that, like honor, basically, right? So that's really what's on my mind, is more or less this: why did the Muslim world lag behind Europe? That to me is the most important question for Muslims
I
all around the world.
I do think I have a proposed answer for it if you would like to hear it.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
So first of all, let me establish something. Since the days of the Prophet, Muslims were against modernism. Now you might say, how is that possible? Modernism as a phenomenon only started really occurring before the French Revolution, shortly before, after. But in honesty, there was this, like, in the Muslim world, there's this concept that has been there since. Basically, there was this hadith in Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, very, very popular hadith, in which it was written, the end times will come when these primitive Arab tribesmen who develop simple machineries to fulfill simple tasks, when these tribes start competing with each other to create incredibly tall buildings. Now, as you
Hmm.
know,
Oh,
that's happened.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
happening in Saudi Arabia. And why was there this, you could say, this superstition against this this very recent architectural phenomena? Why were they railing against it at the time of the Prophet thousands of years ago? Well, it's very simple. It's because I think the, Islam had this fixed rate of development, right? Because the way they viewed material, the way they viewed essence, uh, they viewed it in a sort of a linear sense of development, right? It wasn't as if somebody superimposed one form upon the other, and there was a great struggle which ended up sublating the two concepts. In Islam, the development was a much more linear process. One concept meets another concept, and they quickly sublate. They quickly sublate into these constant linear processes. Now, here's the argument I would make for the West. The West faced a lot more struggle in its development because the West, well, these all these individuals were so opposed to each other that in their struggles, uh, the development was hyper accelerated. If that makes any sense,
Yes, it
right?
does. It does. That was actually Hegel's argument himself. Hegel said that the almost infinite self particularization and gradual determinate development of the European small principalities in tiny states was much slower and much more gradual in the sense of like the rapidity of the development of enlightenment and sciences and so on. Whereas for him, the Islamic dialectic, so to speak, was really one of this kind of rapid, as you described, linear development, which left no space for the openness of contradiction itself.
Exactly, exactly. And so one of the issues was because there was this space of rapid linear development, when opposition would rise up from the West and plant itself in the seeds of the East, there was an alien reaction to it which completely halted organic development. So I'll try to explain this. The Ottoman Empire was one of these glaring examples within history. The Ottomans, when they started developing, at first they were a Muslim Beylik, they were nomadic, they were Turkic.
Yeah,
When, when they westernized, they received these Enlightenment ideas in the Renaissance. They allied with France. They developed these concepts of the Western individual, and they were the ones who were mostly reading stuff like the Cartesian cogito, right?
yeah,
Um, well, the rest of the East was not exposed to this. Now, what happened was when the Ottoman sphere of thought, which was importing itself from the West, uh, when it imported itself from the West, the East did not know how to respond to this because unlike all their other linear, rapid states of development, where okay, two opposing things meet and sublate very quickly, all of a sudden development was halted because they didn't really know how to respond to the Ottoman Empire. And you will notice the Ottoman Empire historically started declining rapidly because they didn't have any development, because they had locked themselves between two strong contradictions where they were not developing, right? And
it's almost as if they reached the end of history too fast.
yes, yes, exactly. They reached the Eastern philosophies. They had it. They possessed the Eastern philosophies, but at the same time, the Western developing forces were starting to impose themselves on this region, on this continent, and the Ottomans suffered between these two contradictions and could not come to some sort of sublation between the two, if you get what I'm saying. And what ended up happening was, because of that, the Ottomans, who were the dominant Eastern power, when they started to decline, the Middle East started to decline, and then gradually you see colonialism, imperialism, imperial expansion.
To me, this is what my collective has investigated the most. The key to understanding Islam is a future-oriented religion, not a past-oriented religion. Judaism, for example, is about the past story of the people of Israel and the covenant and so on and so on. And it's a religion about Moses and Abraham going back to the past. But Islam is a future-oriented religion. And to me, the key of Islam's world historic significance lies in the landed nomadic empires as a whole, from the Mongols to the Turks to the rest. These are the ones who gave. I think there are even passages indicating, not in the Quran, but in other texts, that these nomadic steppe peoples were the force of the end times. Like the I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, like the ones who wear horsehair on their feet or whatever. These are the force of the apocalypse. Islam already experienced its eschatological end times, its apocalypse, in the form of the invading nomadic Turkic and Mongol forces in the Middle East.
Yeah,
And
they
this was the kind of introduction of this cemented this permanent state of contradiction and the rapid linear development I think you're talking about, where they did not come from, they were not Arabs, they were not originally Muslim either. This is another kind of scandal. But they later would convert, but they still represented the one exception within the body of the kind of Muslim ummah, so to speak, while at the same time being their guardians. This is a very common phenomena, by the way. For example, in Egypt, the Mamluks became the ruling dynasty, right? And the Mamluks were foreigners from Islam who were molded in the image of Islam, right? And the significance of that is basically like they're both outside and within, but they're the one exception within the whole ummah that represents this outsideness, right?
Yeah.
They're foreigners, but at the same time, the guardians of the familial. So,
Yeah. And
to me, there's an extremely interesting relationship between settled civilizations and nomadic. This is the biggest contradiction in the whole history of mankind, right? The settled and the nomadic. It's always been a recurring contradiction. Islam it had its origins in the Bedouins, a nomadic people, right? And it took its the highest extent of its development was through other nomadic empires like the Mongols, the Turks, and especially the Turks, really, honestly. But
yeah,
also the Berbers in North Africa and so on. But I mean, this is not a coincidence. It's the nature of the religion itself in relation to humanity. But what's interesting to me, what I mean to say with this, is that especially with the Mongol invasions, you do see an apocalypse analogous to that of modernity, which is to say, this process that was such a trauma and shock to what everyone had expected beforehand. These foreigners who were not even Muslim came and basically defeated and conquered everyone. Was a fundamental, lasting, historical point of trauma, I think. Not dissimilar to the way modernity introduced itself for Christian peoples, right? On other peoples throughout the world. And furthermore, you also see parallels in the form of like the kind of standardization of the societies, the kind of unprecedented level of religious tolerance, the formation of what appears to types of secular governance, even under the Mongols. To me, that Islam basically, I'm torn between two ideas. One is that Islam was modernity. It is literally the religious form of modernity that happened too early. Two, that Islam was always modern, so to speak, in a sense. And that, or that two, Islam corresponded to this kind of Mongol modernity. Right? Islam experienced its modernity earlier than Europe did. And as a matter
It's
of fact, the European modernity was just a copy of the Islamic one.
Yeah, it's very interesting how you phrase that, because I was thinking about this, and the way you phrased it, that it is modernity. That's actually brilliant, because when you if you look at the sources of the early sources, the Muslims always thought that they were reaching an end of history soon. So I'll
Yeah,
give you an example. Did you know this? Early Muslims thought that the end of history was the conquest of Constantinople. Uh,
yeah.
uh, in the Hadith, in the very early Hadith, it is written, when we will conquer Constantinople, we will basically bring about an end of history.
And
So they were,
it's also the Gog and Magog. It's very clear to me the people who are outside of what is it? The Wall of Alexander. What is it called again? It's in Persia.
it's the Dul Qarnain's,
Dul Qarnain. Yeah. You know, beyond that wall is the nomadic steppe peoples who would eventually conquer Constantinople itself
yeah,
under the
and so
banner of Islam.
yeah, it's really fascinating that
Yeah.
Islam was actually locked between these two great forces, Rome, what they considered Rome, and the Mongols. And so, because of this, when encountering these two forces, they actually thought they were reaching an end of history. They rapidly developed, and unlike again the West, which locked itself into these superimpositions. And so, because of that, when we reach the Ottoman Empire, now we have a great crisis. The Ottoman Empire cannot identify its development. It cannot identify it. Is my development that of the nomadic Eastern forces, or the Islamic Arabian forces, or the Western secularizing forces? And the Ottomans, they simply could not realize, right? They could not realize where they were headed, in a sense. They could not come to the terms. Then, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the rest of the Middle Eastern world soon succumbed to the imperialist forces. So they succumbed to the imperialist forces. And when the Western peoples descended upon Islam, they did not see this rapid chain of development, this assimilation of contradictions, right? Which, by the way, if you ask Hegel, that's a very successful society. They were able to sublate so much in such a at such a rapid pace compared to the West. When they met this culture, when the imperialist forces met this culture, all they saw in it was, this is the antithetical construction of Christianity,
Yeah.
and they imposed upon it. It's, well, this is just Eastern Christianity, and as we know, the Asiatics, they're a bunch of savages, and so
Yeah.
yeah, and so this Asiatic Christianity is simply it only seeks to reflect our superior Western Christianity, and uh, correct me if I'm wrong, but this does sound sort of similar to Hegel's master-slave dialectics, right?
Yeah, that's an interest. I mean, Fanon directly talks about that in the war in Algeria, specifically about Islam. But to me, here really is the kicker. That's really tough for me to understand.